Social welfare policy in the 19th century. After gaining independence from England, Americans were free to shape their newly formed nation, geographically and institutionally. There were some challenges to the new nation: rapid settlement of the frontier, the Civil War, sexism and racism, and the development of the industrial system. Early American cities in the 19th century. There were no housing codes, so shantytowns and tenements were quickly built. This caused an abundant number of health hazards, which led to disease and epidemics. Prostitution, gambling, begging, and drinking were rampant. There was an overall absence of government institutions, churches, and local leaders. So in the first half of the 19th century, citizens battled unlawful behavior with policy initiatives. A typical work week was 6 12-hour days, so job injury was high, and a wave of strikes occurred between the 1820s and 1830s. In the early mid to 19th century, America realized there was a problem and developed 3 kinds of social policies. Number 1 consisted of moral treatment of those who had fallen into a sinful lifestyle. Number 2 initiated to give Americans political, economic, and social opportunities, while 3 devised to control, regulate, and oppress people of color. The temperance movement. It was the largest social reform movement in the several decades before the Civil War. They began to see social drinking as immoral behavior, and they began to restrict licenses for taverns, tax alcohol heavily, and limit sales. Anti-pauperism and anti-poverty strategies. Number 1 was to increase the number of almshouses and modify internal operations to make them deterrent. Number 2 was to establish personal contact with low-income youth. Number 3 was to establish systems of surveillance so that charity was not given indiscriminately to destitute persons. Now, Dorothea Dix was a very important person in this time period. She lobbied for the construction of mental institutions. She was a successful policy advocate who persuaded state legislators to establish at least 33 mental health facilities over 20 years. She was an advocate for mentally ill persons after the Civil War and illustrated the importance of troubleshooting and implementation. Public education. In the start of the 19th century, there were no public schools. By the mid-1800s, there was a national network of primary and secondary schools. This rise in public education provided more than half of white children between the ages of 5 and 19 an education. The land policy. The federal government gave unsettled land to settlers. People could buy unlimited amounts, and they distributed it to freed slaves and other persons of color. Eventually, most land ended up in the hands of the railroad companies, though. The first Americans kept being pushed off their land with treaties that gave them almost no compensation. A massacre of Native Americans left them with close to nothing. Some other important policies were the 13th Amendment, 14th Amendment, 15th Amendment. The 13th illegally ended slavery throughout the U.S. in 1865. The 14th, in 1868, allowed all citizens to have equal protection under the law, while the 15th established universal suffrage for all adult males in 1870.
Created using Powtoon.